Good day. Welcome again to Cheryl's Kitchen. As a warning, I would like to take this opportunity to advise those who may be triggered by my subjects to use some discretion. Quite often my subjects are dark and graphic, so viewer, listener discretion is advised. This is a subject I would have covered at some point in time, but since it's topical, I'll cover it today. Let's look into Russian history. It's a long, dark history, and I'm sure a number of Russian scholars will dispute this. So I thought I'd do a two-part series. The pre-1917 in part 1 and post-1917 in part 2. Russia itself is located in both Eastern Europe and Asia. It's the largest country in terms of landmass in the world. Its population is quite large at about 146 million people. Its sheer size and diversity make it a difficult country to govern. Russia has been ruled by a monarchy from about 1500 to 1917. In 1917 to 1991, the communists were in power, followed by a brief experiment with democracy to about 2000. And as of 2000, an autocrat oligarchy has ruled to the current day. Russia has no experience with democracy. The Russian people have been ruled by a monarchy or a dictator for its entire existence. So like I said, I'll split this into two parts, pre-1917 and post-1917, and I'll look at the four monarchs who ruled Russia. Four of the monarchs, not just four. The four I've chosen are Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, Peter I, also known as Peter the Great, Catherine II, known as Catherine the Great, and Nicholas II, who was the last Tsar of Russia. So before we begin on the monarchs that I'm going to talk about, I want to talk about monarchies in general, kings, queens, czars, whatever. I kind of put them into three categories. First of all, the somewhat benevolent despot, one who kind of cares for his people, but has still got a lot of flaws. So in that category, I'd put Peter the Great, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth I, just to name a few. All these monarchs were great in their own right, but they all had people executed at their behest. Wives. Henry VIII had a number of wives beheaded. Elizabeth I had her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, beheaded. They are not what you would call good people. The second kind of monarch I would like to describe is the dullard, the dunce, the dimwit, and that's easily manipulated by his advisors. Some of these monarchs were very young at the time, so the fault is not theirs alone. But Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was a grown man, and one of his advisors he should have fired years later. The last type of monarch I want to describe is the completely psychopathic, cruel, genocidal monarch. The ones that impale or crucify or behead their subjects and their enemies. Bloody Mary wasn't given that name because she invented a nice drink. She was given that name because she had 312 people beheaded during her reign, including a 16-year-old girl, Lady Jane Grey. There's a backstory for that, and I will get to that on another episode. So let's go into the first Tsar, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV was the first ruler to use the title Tsar, which is derived from the Latin Caesar. Actually, he was 3 years old in 1533 when he inherited the title of Grand Prince of Moscow upon the death of his father. Ivan, in his younger years, tossed his pets from the highest towers, He thought it was really fun to watch them crash into the pavement below and die. In his later years, he and his gang bullied, beat, raped, and maybe murdered people. As you can see, we had a serial killer as a future ruler. He was 13 when he had a prince beaten to death for tormenting him as a child. Ivan took control of his throne in 1547. He was 16 years old at the time. He expanded Russia during his rule by wars of conquest. Ivan was ruthless. He was paranoid, and not without good reason. If you've watched Game of Thrones, you'll know why. Let's talk about something he had developed. He formed a group of people called the Oprichniki, and I really apologize for my pronunciation. I'm not Russian, so please accept my apologies. If any of you are Lord of the Rings fans, you'll understand this. Ivan the Terrible created a gang of thugs to terrorize the population into submission, called the Oprichniki. Think of the Lord of the Rings dark riders chasing the hobbits. Beware the dog head. They used to have dogs' heads dangle from their horses. They dressed in black robes, riding around, terrorizing the common folk. And this is how Ivan kept the common folk in line. Ivan had several wives, many of whom were poisoned or sent off to a convent. Ivan killed his son and heir in a fit of rage. He struck him so hard with a wooden staff, it killed him. Ivan later died in 1584, leaving Russia exhausted and broke. We'll move on about 100 years, I guess, and we'll talk about Peter I, also known as Peter the Great. He came to power in 1689 and died in 1725. He was raised in the royal household, and that's not the best place to learn how to rule. After 1696, he traveled extensively through Europe incognito and then returned to modernize Russia. This is where he gets the qualifier, the Great. He also built St. Petersburg, and it was designed along Western lines, and it was now a seaport. Russia, as a naval power, is just on the horizon. For all his good things he did, there was some bad mixed in. He was domineering towards his wives. He had several of them. Perhaps he was a domestic abuser, as we would know them today. His son Alexei was tortured and died at his order. He was intimidating, almost 7 feet tall, according to the history books, which is huge by today's standards, but if you're thinking the late 1600s, early 1700s, he must have been enormous. He reformed Russia, but only to expand Russia, not because he was interested in things or we want to see the betterment of his people. It was for the betterment and the expansion of Russia. Peter the Great may have been a great man, but he was not a good man. And if you think Dracula Vlad was the only impaler in Eastern Europe, you'd be wrong. Peter the Great also had people impaled. So let's move forward a bit, and we'll talk about Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was married to Peter III, who was the grandson of Peter the Great. Peter III was one of those dullard monarchs I spoke about. He never liked Russia, and Russia never liked him. His wife Sophia overthrew him, and this woman is Catherine the Great. Peter III was another domestic abuser by our standards. Catherine was German by birth, but Russia suited her well. In 1762, she had Peter arrested, and he abdicated the throne. She took over. Later, Peter died or was murdered in prison. It's said that Catherine had many lovers, and this appears to be true. This seems to be the focus of her reign in all the history books. There was much unrest in Russia during her time as Tsarina, as she had made a lot of enemies. She also passed away in 1796, perhaps from a stroke. So we'll go forward a bit more, this time to 1894. Tsar Nicholas II has just been coronated. Nicholas is a Romanov. The Romanovs have ruled Russia since 1613. Nicholas was the last of that dynasty. Nicholas II was anti-Semitic and reportedly not all that bright. He created a secret police, and his secret police invented the protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a huge lie, which many dunces still believe is true today. Times they were a-changing during his reign, and he never really caught on. Thousands were executed or sent to the Gulag for sedition. Or in other words, they were plotting to overthrow the emperor, happened to be Nicholas II. But any discussion of Nicholas II has to include this historical figure. A peasant from Siberia who somehow managed to work his way into the royal household. We're talking about Rasputin, of course. So we have to go into some family dynamics to understand why Rasputin held such great sway in the royal household. Alexandra was Queen Victoria's granddaughter. The genes she had were passed on from mother to son, as her son Alexei, only son and heir to the throne, had hemophilia. Queen Victoria was also related by blood to the Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. Getting back to Alexei, Alexei was a young boy in poor health, and any fall, any bump could potentially kill him. So he was surrounded by doctors all the time. The doctors, however, could do little for him. So the Empress, Alexandra, turned to more unconventional healing, like Rasputin. This was a toxic relationship. How a peasant from Siberia worked his way up to the Empress's side is something that I have no clue how he would have done it. And that's a story all by itself, but maybe for another time. The song says it all. Rah, rah, Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. There is no evidence to prove she was sexually involved with him, although it was still scandalous behavior for the Tsarina to hang out with a common peasant such as Rasputin. A group of nobles assassinated him in December 1916, and so they shot him till he was dead. So let's go back to Tsar Nicholas II. So briefly, in March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. And here we enter the era of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who would not be satisfied by sharing power with anybody else. Lenin wanted power for himself. Civil war ensued. The White Russians or the Royalists against the Bolsheviks or the Reds. And that didn't end until 1923. In March 1918, Russia withdrew out of World War I. So let's talk about the end of the rule of the Romanovs. Europe's monarchs had basically abandoned the Romanovs, although many of them were related. King George V of England refused to grant them safe haven in Britain, even though Alexandra was a cousin. They were stranded in Russia, no allies, nobody coming to the rescue, and were seen as an embarrassing family amongst Europe's monarchies. We'll speak more of the Bolsheviks later, but on 17 July 1918, the entire family was murdered by firing squad. So while I was researching this, I found a little sideline. In 1817, Russia invaded the northern Caucasus region. It was termed a policing action. And its goal was to stop the raids into Russian territory by the tribes people in the Caucasus area. Does this sound familiar? So, this concludes part one of my Russian series. There might be more than 2 parts, because I may not be able to do Russian history justice in 2 parts. So, thank you for reviewing and listening, and let's be careful out there.